Here is your content warning for violence, gore, flashing images, and spoilers. There are very few franchises that I love more than Final Destination. These movies are a masterclass in sound design, tension building, and foreshadowing. I love how these movies echo forward and backward through time, calling back to things in the past while also trying to tell you about the future. It's a very trans-temporal franchise in that way. So much so that I would consider it to be a close relative of the Saw franchise, what may very well be my all-time favorite horror franchise, at least until Jigsaw and Spiral were made, but we won't go into that. Mostly because I spent an entire video discussing Jigsaw when it first came out, which you can watch by clicking the link in the corner. As for Spiral, it just wasn't worth talking about.
I'ma let 'em spin like a spiral. Straight up. I don't got no love for no rival. Straight up.
But when you really look at them, both franchises do have a lot in common. Not only are both box office legends in their own respects, becoming some of the biggest names in horror, but they both have a dense lore and a focus on connective tissue, which, as many of you know, I always admire. And much like Saw's famous Hello Zep theme that always gets remixed and played during a big twist, Final Destination has a musical motif of its own. The creative twist here being that in the first film, the motif is slow and creeping. And gradually across the films becomes faster and angrier, scaling up with the gruesomeness of the deaths and showcasing how truly pissed off death is getting. However, the key difference here is that Final Destination focuses more on being a rip-roaring roller coaster gore fest, as opposed to Saw's more philosophical, ethical approach to horror. Which is perfectly fine, because as a Joyride series, it absolutely succeeds at being innately fun. But as a major lore hound who revels in connecting the dots, I figure it's high time to devote a video to tracking the progression and evolution of Death's design across the films. Because while many would look at this franchise and call it a meager variation of the typical slasher format, I take issue with that and insist that there is more to it. And with another installment looming on the horizon, what better time to talk about this franchise than now? So move over, Bloodworth. It's my turn to perform this autopsy. So let's kick things off with 1999's psychological horror film, Final Destination. One of my favorite fun facts about this movie is that, originally, the idea for this film began its life as a script for The X-Files. And while it totally still has that vibe about it, I think it was absolutely the right call to give this a bigger focus, rather than make it yet another one-and-done episodic entry in a show that already had so many irons in the fire. Look, I like The X-Files as much as the next guy, but the Monster of the Week format has really gotten worn out by this point, and a big part of that is because of The X-Files. The plot of the first movie follows a group of kids going on a school field trip to Paris, one of whom receives a premonition that their plane is going to explode. Consequently, they get off the plane only for the premonition to come true. However, unbeknownst to them, they're actually the first people in all of history to escape their fated deaths. And shortly after returning to their normal lives, death starts picking them off one at a time in order to correct the mistake. And this basic format becomes the guide for every movie following this too. A group of people who escape a terrible disaster only for death to come for them because their time is up. The first entry in the Final Destination franchise feels slightly different to the rest of the entries due to its slower pacing and greater focus on the psychological horror elements, which, after rewatching the franchise to refresh myself for this video, I actually feel works to its benefit. It's a good warm-up before things start going balls to the wall. Because as the films go on, the ever-growing cast of soon-to-be corpses gets larger and larger in order to create more cannon fodder for death to rip apart in a spectacular fashion. Which is yet another similarity to the Saw franchise, which started out with simply 2 victims in a room and ended up with a carnival of cadavers. Ooh, that's a good name for a band. Carnival of Cadavers. Joe, write that down. Anyway, the first film introduces the infamous Flight 180, which I consider one of the greatest motifs in cinema, due to its reoccurring prominence across the entire series. Because it's not merely some Easter egg in the background meant only as a fun nod. As we find out later, there is a reason it shows up. But we'll get to that. No time is wasted setting the tone for this movie, opening with lots of really fun foreshadowing that will continue throughout the film. Things like the spinning fan blade, which represents the engines of Flight 180, or the guillotine in the book, which foreshadows the character whose head gets cut off later. I'll even give you one more. The skeleton hanging from a noose, which represents the character who gets strangled. This starts a direct dialogue with the audience that every film following this continues, practically begging the audience to read into every little detail that's presented. Which is really cool, because this is exactly what happens to the characters in all the movies when they know that death is coming for them. They start reading into every little thing that happens. So it's a really great way to put the audience in the character's shoes.
Arrested. Tetanus. Nice one. I overlooked it. Tried to capitalize, but I caught you. You fuck. I could beat you. Yeah, maybe not forever. But I got this cabin rigged to beat you now.
However, while this is a paranoia nightmare for the characters, it's a super fun game for the eagle-eyed audience member. And as the franchise continues, the writers start to throw in red herrings to mislead everyone, making the game even more fun, for the most part. And remember, all this was established in just the intro credits. Just wow. Talk about not wasting any runtime. And very early into this first movie, the rules of this universe start to become established. Not only this, but the format for every movie preceding this is set in stone too. We always have our main character, who I always referred to as the Prophet, as a kind of shorthand. I've always referred to them this way due to the fact that they're given advanced knowledge of the future which they can then avert or change. There's no way I'm remembering everyone's name. While this seems pretty straightforward, I am still picking apart how and why the prophets across the films exist in the first place. So much so that one theory I keep going back and forth on is the possibility that death isn't the only active force in these movies. Perhaps life is as well. In the Final Destination franchise, death is fleshed out and treated almost like an unseen character in itself. If this were a slasher movie, death would be the antagonist. It's vengeful, cruel, and relentless. But I've often considered that if death can be a character, why can't life be a character too? Of course, life is not as clearly showcased as death, being a much more subtle force. But you could make an argument that its involvement in these films can be tracked. In fact, I'll show you what I mean across this video. But the ultimate question is, why are people allowed to see the future in order to avert it in the first place? This is a question that's been nagging me at the back of my mind since the very first installment. I would argue that prophets are chosen by life in order to throw off death's design, and these two cosmic forces battle with one another in an eternal struggle in the background across all 5 films. Like a massive chess game between two non-corporeal beings using the lives of pathetic mortals as their pawns. As there's no clear evidence of where the visions of the future come from, this theory isn't really based on much more than simple headcanon on my part. But it is a really fun thing to think about. And focusing less on my headcanon and more on the concrete rules that are established within the film, we learn that death's design, or death's list, follows a specific order. People must die in the same order that they were destined to. But in spite of this, the prophet can intervene in someone's death in order to save them, which then makes death skip over them and move on to the next person. However, as we learned during the ending of the first film, death will always come back around to the top of the list when it reaches the end, and come for those who've been saved. So in the end, it's only a temporary reprieve from its onslaught. Which is a really cool twist to end the first movie on, and shows how death may not be able to change the rules, but it can add new ones. Death can evolve. This is a really cool dynamic, and at this point, the lore is at its simplest to understand. I say this because, as the films go on, Death, being its own character, learns how people cheat it and start making loopholes in the rules to catch people up. And thus, the ongoing lore grows in complexity. I love this though, as it gives the entire franchise so much more depth than just your typical slasher, where the antagonist typically kills without thought or intention. And of course, how can I talk about the Final Destination franchise without mentioning the wonderful character of the mortician, William Bloodworth, played to immaculate perfection by Tony Todd.
Shh. Please. You'll wake the dead.
Bloodworth is one of the most enigmatic characters ever captured on film, and his appearance in almost every movie is something I always look forward to.
In death, there are no accidents, no coincidences, no mishaps, and no escapes. Every single move we make, from the mundane to the monumental, the red light that we stop at or run, the people we have sex with or won't with us, the airplanes that we ride or walk out of. It's all part of death's sadistic design, leading to the grave.
Does that mean if you figure out the design, you can cheat death?
Alex, you've already done that by walking off the plane. Your friend's departure shows that death has a new design for all of you. Now you have to figure out how and when it's coming back at you. But remember, the risk of cheating the plan, of disrespecting the design, could incite a fury that could terrorize even the Grim Reaper. And you don't even want to fuck with that, Mac Daddy.
That is enigmatic. That is textbook enigmatic.
Bloodworth always acts as a kind of advisor to the Prophet, and the portrayal of the character makes it very hard to determine where his loyalties lie. On the surface, you would think he's the embodiment of death. However, this has never sat right with me because he gives advice to the people escaping death. Why would death help the people he's trying to kill? However, if you take my headcanon into account, perhaps he's the embodiment of life. I do like this interpretation, as it's a nice inverse to how he's portrayed. A creepy mortician that makes you feel uneasy. As the old adage goes, never judge a book by the cover. However, this interpretation isn't foolproof, and I can admit that. Still, there is one other possibility. He's just a mortician. A guy who's lived around death his entire life, and therefore knows its rules. Yet even this theory has holes, which you'll see as we go through the rest of the video. Still, regardless of which side he's on, Tony Todd makes this character work so well. His performance is what makes you want to figure this character out. Bloodworth is easily one of the most iconic parts of the franchise, and his casting was a stroke of genius. However, focusing more on the plot of the first movie itself, it is certainly a solid entry. Is it the best in the series, though? Well, I wouldn't go that far. There are several moments of artificially forced conflict that serve nothing but to set up scenes and character dynamics later in the film, showing that in some ways, the movie is kind of reverse engineered, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but I just shouldn't be able to notice the hand of the writer that easily. Like, these two get into fights so often, and in ways that are super contrived and unnatural, which is clearly setting up how this character feels he's losing control of his life. But it's done in such a ham-fisted way. And there are also a few moments where you have to suspend your disbelief, such as this scene here where they supposedly designed, organized, and built an entire monument and memorial to the victims of Flight 180 in 39 days. I guess the committee that organized all this are prophets too. Not only is this unrealistic, but they could have just cut this line of dialogue and the scene would have been bulletproof. The inclusion of this line was entirely unnecessary. That being said, despite the movie's occasional goof-ups, none of them ever truly sink the film. If you can look past those small moments, the movie as a whole does hold up.
Whoa, mama, you gotta leave that on. Yeah, it's like, it's gotta be on the bag, or at least with the bag. For luck.
Where would you get a nutball idea like that?
Remember this. I have a theory that this is the inciting action for the entire... Next, let us take the scalpel to 2003's Final Destination 2. The second installment in the franchise does a great job of continuing the evolution of Death's design and essentially picking up the torch and running with it.
Death has this grand design that we all fit into. So when Alex Browning got off that plane and took the other survivors with him, he basically screwed up Death's plan. And that's what I'm trying to warn people about.
And the fact that all of the survivors have died is your evidence of this?
Well, it's not so much that the survivors died, but it's the way that they died. I mean, there were so many weird, seemingly random things about the way they died. It just didn't make sense.
And honestly, Final Destination 2 and 3 are pretty much tied as my favorites. The reason being, Final Destination 2 puts a ton of work into its lore, which is always important to me. Although, Final Destination 3 has a ridiculous amount of fun with its motifs, which I think are some of the best in the franchise. So these two movies are pretty neck and neck for me. But aside from giving an entire generation of audience goers a crippling fear of log trucks, myself included, Final Destination 2 is also notable for doing something none of the other sequels ever attempt again: a returning survivor. Across all 5 installments, Clear Rivers is the only survivor to ever live beyond their introductory movie. And as a direct connection to the first film, I figured the best place to start is with her. And what a great character she is. At the end of the first movie, Clear and Alex, the first movie's prophet, are the only characters to make it to the credits. And very quickly, the movie establishes that even Alex didn't survive, having died off-screen between the first movie and the second. Which, I will admit, is a bit of a letdown since he was the very first prophet, and essentially started the chain of events that led to every movie. But whatever, I can roll with it. Clear, however, has managed to survive by having herself committed to an asylum and spending the rest of her days in an empty, padded cell. A clever trick that does seem to work, which always seemed a little weird to me. I mean, this is death we're talking about. If it really wanted her dead, it could just burn down the asylum or start a gas leak. Which leads to my theory. I think when the prophet dies, it's a much bigger deal to Death, since, essentially, there's no one left to give the other survivors clues to who will die next. Which is actually something that life, if it is its own character, tries to counter in this movie by sharing the gift of foresight with all the survivors to varying degrees. Like I said, cosmic chess game. Both sides evolve their ideas. But basically, what I'm getting at here is that when Alex died, it only bought Clear some time. But I don't think Death ever truly let her go, and I don't think the padded cell would have protected her for much longer either. Luckily though, the writing doesn't let the padded cell turn into plot armor, by essentially having Clear decide of her own free will that she should leave. But focusing more on the lore, in this film, Death tries to get the upper hand by working the list backward in order to throw off the group.
This doesn't make sense. You said that you die in the order you originally meant to.
But my friends died last in my premonition, not first.
Wait. Died last. Backwards.
Later in the movie, it's explained that each of the characters in this film had a direct experience with one of the survivors of Flight 180, after the first movie's survivors were supposed to die in the plane. And as a result of this interaction, each escaped their own individual predestined demise.
You want weird? Last year, my partner and I were heading out when a call came in about a train wreck. Frank decided to let me handle it alone. He died that night in a shootout. The call about the train wreck that saved my life. That was the night I scraped up Billy Hitchcock. If that call had come in just 10 seconds later, I'd be dead too.
Okay, so last May, I'm supposed to go and stay at this cheesy little bed and breakfast in Pennsylvania, right?
So what happened?
I don't know. I never made it. The bus I was on splattered some girl all over the road.
Hey, do you guys remember that theater in Paris that collapsed last year and killed everybody inside? Well, I had tickets to go. All of a sudden, this dude, out of nowhere, just gets whacked by this falling sign.
The teacher I replaced. Her name was Val Luton. She was from Mount Abram. She died in an explosion.
Essentially, this all comes down to timelines. When someone avoids their fated death, the moment that they survive it, they start throwing off the timelines of all the people they interact with, because they're meant to be dead, and thus should no longer have an influence on the living world. Death is working the list backward in order to prevent the ripple effect from leading to more people surviving, who in turn go off and accidentally throw off more people's timelines, and so on forever until the entire grand design is destroyed. You can see what a slippery slope this is in the ending scene, where a random side character that was casually saved during this movie is blown up by death, because their natural demise was interfered with by someone who was supposed to be dead already. Just like the survivors of Flight 180, who were supposed to be dead, but intervened in the deaths of this movie's group of survivors. Basically, death is still cleaning up the mess from the first film. Really, this makes Death an almost sympathetic character, because all it's trying to do is stop a fire that started with Flight 180 and just keep spreading. All because some nerd got a prophecy of his death one time. And just to be clear on this, the guy from the ending scene was 3 times removed from Flight 180, and yet Flight 180 was still, inadvertently, the cause for him not dying when he was supposed to. I think this is a genius bit of writing that not only makes this movie better, but props up the first film as well. Which is what all the best written lore does. It works in tandem with everything that's come before it. You hear that, Chris Chibnall? Oh, I'll get to you in due time. However, that isn't all that's added to the lore in this one. We also learn that, since death works in a particular order, if a character tries to take their own life before their turn on the list, it will always fail. Essentially, this makes them immortal until it's their turn, which is another stroke of brilliance that gives the entire cast of characters the confidence to continue pushing the plot forward. As opposed to what would happen in real life, where everyone would just barricade themselves in a room and never leave, which just wouldn't be as fun of a movie to watch. But this movie also showcases a motive for death as well. Should the ripple effect continue indefinitely, the world would be full of immortals due to the fact that the order has been halted. The survivors have to be contained, otherwise the entire natural order will be compromised. The human population will skyrocket, the Earth's resources will be used up, and it would essentially start the end of the world, Torchwood Miracle Day style. And for whatever reason, this is what life wants, which almost makes life seem like the bad guy here. But again, this is all my headcanon. None of this is directly implied by the movies themselves. But life does seem to be intervening more here, which brings me to the next part of the lore that this movie creates. Yeah, there's a lot of lore in this one. You can see why it's one of my favorites. In a scene where my boy Bloodworth gives the survivors some cryptic advice, he says,
"If you know of anything that could help us, what harm could it do?"
Only new life can defeat death.
What the hell does that mean?
Some people say there's a balance to everything. For every life, there's a death. For every death, there is a life. But the introduction of life that was not meant to be, that could invalidate the list. Force death to start anew. You have to follow the signs, Kimberly.
How do you know my name?
Much like the Prophet, Bloodworth even displays a level of precognition himself, foreshadowing Clear's death later in the movie with this line.
But Alex and I cheated death not once but dozens of times. The design is flawed. It can be beaten.
Such fire in you now. people are always most alive just before they die, don't you think?
The survivors misinterpret this advice, thinking it applies to a pregnant woman who's later revealed to not even be on death's list. However, while this is incorrect, it does still work, because when the pregnant woman does ultimately give birth, it does freak death out and make it back off of everyone as soon as the child is born. Which really doesn't make a ton of sense if neither the parent or child were ever on the list. The pregnant woman
was just a red herring.
I always chalked this up to Death having to recalculate the design to account for this new life. Or perhaps life and death were caught up bickering over who has true claim over this new soul. Regardless, shortly thereafter, the list continues and everyone realizes their lives are in danger once more, leading to a scene where I can only assume life provides the perfect chain of events to tell the Prophet exactly what Bloodworth meant. This, to me at least, is a far more brazen intervention on life's part in order to keep these characters alive. But that's just part of the game. No one side can always be winning, and both sides play dirty to get the advantage. At this point, the Prophet realizes that they have to die and be brought back to life in order to escape death and gain a second chance at life. Then, after drowning and being brought back, this theory is proven true. And I just have to say, I really like how this is indicated to the audience by having the color grading for the film shift from a dead body blue to a vibrant life yellow. That was a really nice touch. So congratulations to these two, because they seem to be the only ones to actually successfully escape death. Because as far as I'm aware, they never actually die. The next movie doesn't mention them in any way, which, depending on who you are, fundamentally changes your view of future installments in a pretty big way. Knowing that the characters can actually escape death will either keep you rooting for the survivors because you know it's possible to win, or it takes away some of the ethereal nature of death because it can be outsmarted by a dumbass human. But the caveat here is that 1, you have to actually figure out Bloodworth's advice, 2, you have to somehow learn that dying and coming back to life is the key, and 3, pray to whatever deity you like that death hasn't somehow closed that loophole. And since none of this new lore is ever used again, personally, I would say that death closed the loophole. It worked this one time, but death learns and it won't be cheated again. Next up, let's dive into the remains of 2006's Final Destination 3. As I previously stated, Final Destination 3 is pretty high up in my books. And, speaking personally here, I've always felt that this was when the franchise peaked. It isn't so much that the following movies were bad, more so that they just never got any better than this. So, with that said, what makes this one so great? Well, let's make our first incision and find out. There are several things that this movie does to shake things up from previous installments. In this entry, a high school yearbook photographer becomes the Prophet, and her clairvoyant abilities to predict death's design manifest in her pictures purely by accident. This movie also twists the formula by having someone other than the Prophet start piecing together that death is coming back for the group after they survive a roller coaster accident. I really like this because it shows how the Prophets deal with the knowledge of their abilities in different ways. And in this one, she just straight up denies anything's happening at first. But luckily she doesn't deny it for too long, which would have become tiresome very quickly. Plus, I've just always liked the Prophet for this film. Not only because I think the actor played the part well, but also, I was a yearbook nerd in high school too. Having that relatability to her did a lot for me. As someone who's used to seeing life through the lens of a camera, capturing fleeting moments of the past, it's really nice to see a camera used to see the future and avoid death itself. But putting aside all my philosophizing, what I love the most about this movie is its dark sense of humor. In most of the films, there's a musical motif that haunts the Prophet and warns them of each film's big disaster. This is referred to by the Final Destination wiki as the Song of Death. In the first movie, it was Rocky Mountain High.
God damn it. Died in a plane crash.
Can we just stop talking about this?
In the second film, it was Highway to Hell, another very clever choice foreshadowing the fiery highway pileup about to happen.
What are you doing?
Oh my God. The 1-year anniversary of the crash of Flight 180 will be held at 8 p.m. tonight at the Mount Abraham High School Auditorium.
Highway to Hell.
Highway to Hell.
And here in Final Destination 3, it is my all-time favorite song of death. Turn around, look at me.
Are you okay?
Please tell me there's a short in your wiring.
Hey!
There is someone walking behind you. Turn around. Look at me.
Get out!
There is someone walking behind you. Turn around. Look at me. There is someone watching your footsteps.
This song still gives me shivers. However, what's different about this one is that it's not a direct prediction of this movie's big disaster sequence, which is how the Song of Death was used in the previous films. Instead, here it's used as an imminent warning of danger. The first time it's played, here in the drive-thru scene, the words focused on are turn around, attempting to get them to see the truck that's about to crash into them. Then, later in the film, we hear the song again, trying to get the prophet to notice that they're being followed by a van. It's notable that one of the lines is, "There's someone walking behind you," because just moments later, the prophet's stalker is literally walking behind them. Another really clever thing about this song is that to turn around is to do a 180, which could be yet another reference to Flight 180. So this song works on so many levels. And what's even better is I'm not even sure if it's life or death using this song. It works both as an omen of death or a clue to survival. This double meaning just blows my mind. So as you can tell, this movie has a fantastic tongue-in-cheek sense of humor. And if you still don't believe me, then may I present you with the tanning bed scene, one of the most memorable moments from this installment. This scene is so much fun. These two escaped a horrific death on a roller coaster at the start of the film, and yet they don't bat an eyelash when they hear this song come on. They're being warned of their imminent demise here, but neither of these characters see the irony of this song playing because of their own shallow short-sightedness. Of course, the audience picks up on this, knowing full well what's about to happen. It's a small thing, but I can't help but love it. It's yet another example of this franchise's ability to speak past the characters to the audience directly, saying, "We know you will understand, we see you." But focusing more generally on the film itself, it fits into the pre-established lore so incredibly well. An example being, even though this group of survivors never learn that you become invincible when it's not your turn to die, which the group in the last movie first discovered, we still see this rule in play during this film several times. All I've ever asked for in my movies and television is dedication to continuity and rules. And while most fail miserably, the connective tissue throughout this franchise is just gorgeous. However, Death still has one more trick up their sleeve at the end of the film, ultimately winning in the end and beating life by bringing all the characters who survived together in one place and taking them all out at once, but still in the order they were meant to die, because Death still follows the rules. This was a really clever idea on Death's part, essentially cutting off escape routes and giving the survivors no time to intervene no matter how much they knew. Even life giving the prophet a vision of what's about to happen doesn't help, because Death accounted for that by locking them in a doomed train that can't be stopped, much like a roller coaster. Death manipulated their lives to get them at this exact place at this exact time. And then the filmmakers had the genius idea to follow up this ending sequence with another hilariously sarcastic song.
People around the world, join hands, start a love train.
God, I love this franchise. This movie is simply a lot of fun for me. I really enjoy watching our two central characters and the dark comedy that works so well here, as well as all the other creative ideas that work in tandem. It isn't without its faults, of course, the biggest one being a severe lack of Bloodworth the Mortician, but he does make two small cameos in the film as a train operator.
This is Booth Street. Next stop is Osborne. End of the line. The next stop is the end of the line.
And as Satan himself.
You can run, but you cannot hide.
Here, get a pic of this.
This is the beginning of the end.
But those are actually really hard to explain away, especially if he's just a human mortician. This does sort of give the impression that he's on a demigod kind of level, and his parts aren't nearly as satisfying since he has no direct interaction with our group of survivors. Tony Todd is the face of this franchise to me, so not seeing him in this was a big letdown. But at the very least, there is dedication to continuity by at least giving him some role in this, even if they are just meager cameos. Otherwise though, this installment is a real roller coaster of an experience, with lots of exciting ups and downs that are a blast to follow. And that's coming from me, and I hate roller coasters. Next, let's slice open 2009's Final Destination 4. Actually, it's called The Final Destination, but I wasn't going to let that interrupt my flow. Knowing where this movie goes, I can understand why they made a big deal out of this being The Final Destination, because this is technically the last movie in the timeline. With the next movie being a prequel, this is the last movie chronologically speaking. It very much feels like it was meant to be the end, and you'll see what I mean here in a moment when I go into more depth. This entry into the series just felt tired somehow, and the level of complexity to the rules of this universe were admittedly becoming difficult to keep up with. However, I always took it as more of a challenge in that respect. No, I think the biggest flaw is how it embraced the biggest trend of the early 2000s, 3D.
The third dimension. Put on these glasses and you'll enter the world of the game.
And while I have a lot to critique about it, I will admit it's actually implemented far better than Saw the Final Chapter did. In that movie's case, they filmed the entire thing with pink blood in order for it to look right on 3D glasses. This ruined any hope for the movie to be successful in any capacity on any other medium, which is why I think it did so much worse financially than its counterparts. Final Destination 4 avoided this pitfall, thankfully, but immediately fucked it up with CGI. Now, I've always felt that the implementation of the 3D during the dirt track disaster at the beginning was actually pretty skillfully balanced. But almost immediately after that, the profit for this film starts receiving horrible-looking CGI premonitions. And while I can understand what the filmmakers were going for, trying to make the audience feel like they're having the premonition themselves, it just didn't translate well and looks like shit. I just don't understand why they didn't take the slightly more practical effect-driven approach that they did with the opening. CGI just never ages well, and it does make the entire film feel kind of dated. Regardless, the plot of the movie does manage to elevate itself above the 3D gimmick, and there is still some enjoyment to be found here. Much like the last movie, there is still a sardonic nature to the story. Like this scene, for example, where a racist man attempts to burn a cross on someone's lawn. This is the only time we hear a song of death in this movie, which is unfortunately far less meaningful, even if it is kind of funny. While it is very satisfying seeing a real piece of shit get what's coming to him, this scene still isn't really in service of anything. It's just more of what we've seen in the past. And that is just the general approach to this movie, doing everything that's been done before, just not quite as well. The Song of Death has no real relevance beyond this one death. The premonitions are not as fun to watch or pick apart, and the acting in general is just kind of mid. Apart from this security guard, who I actually really enjoyed. And fun fact, he's also in the Fallout TV show. His character was entirely designed from the ground up to be unlike any other character we've seen before. How, you ask? By facing death calmly, by no longer fighting it and finding inner peace. Or, well, trying to.
I'm next.
George, you can't give up.
No, it's okay.
What do you mean it's okay? I mean, maybe if we all stick together,
I'm at
then...
peace with it. And, my family's waiting for me. I'm ready to go.
He does ultimately try to commit, which fails because, well, you know by now, it's not his time. He's not next on the list. I found this to be a really nice breath of fresh air. Every character in every movie up to this point has had their entire world shattered by these revelations. But not him. The only reason he gets wrapped up in the events of this film is because he can't off himself, which was a really cool new dynamic. However, focusing on the lore expansion, the most notable change is death is more preemptive in this one. It starts setting traps much further in advance, carrying on what Death learned in the last one, manipulating people's lives to be in the right place at the right time, putting things in motion before the target even comes remotely around in order to keep them from figuring out what will happen. One example of this is the rock that gets thrown by two kids a considerable amount of time before it gets hit by a mower and flies through a survivor's head. This is Death trying to regain the element of surprise, which is something the survivors have been very good at countering. Also, I feel it's important to mention that this may be the first and only appearance of life in the franchise. Earlier in the movie, one of the survivors helps a homeless man on the side of the road.
Excuse me, miss, but could you help a struggling artist?
Sure.
Thanks.
Have a nice day.
Let's see what we got here, Brownie. Penny. That's some bullshit.
And then she survives that attempt on her life. An interesting coincidence at the least. Perhaps even a statement on how our actions can affect our ultimate fate. Then, later at the end of the film, this homeless man shows up in the coffee shop in order to give a cryptic line, very much like how Bloodworth does.
Say, you're the guy who stopped that mall fire, aren't you? You saved a lot of lives, man.
I was just at the right place at the right time.
Mm-hmm. Sometimes that's all it takes.
I do honestly believe that this guy could be the opposite to Tony Todd's Bloodworth, and his character and his cryptic lines work just as well as an embodiment of life or death, depending on who you think is who. And since Bloodworth the Mortician isn't in this one at all, this character being here starts to make a little more sense. In this movie, life tried to get the upper hand by manifesting corporeally just like death does. I absolutely love how this franchise writes in such a way as to tell you everything and nothing at the exact same time. So cool! Switching gears though, this movie also introduces premonitions inside premonitions, which just turns into a huge mess to keep up with. Although, lore-wise, I can explain this. The general vibe I get from this movie is that life and death keep trying to get ahead of one another. Death by setting up traps earlier in advance in ways prophets are less inclined to see, and life by putting premonitions inside premonitions in order to give the survivors more information, thus giving them a better chance to survive. Evidence of this being the line, "It's here," which shows up in multiple of the prophet's visions, which is supposed to warn them about Death's secondary plan. This is all well and good for changing things up, but by this point in the franchise, the audience has little hope of being able to figure all this out before the characters do, due to how complex the lore has gotten and how the new rules feel a lot less like a natural evolution, which does take you out of the movie a bit and brings it a lot closer to the basic slasher genre than I would like. Because if characters are just being killed off in ways that you can no longer predict or understand, in ways that have no meaning, how is that any different than the other slasher icons out there who kill with no rhyme or reason? Death ends up winning in this movie. I know, shocker. killing off all the survivors by hiding a design within a design, and basically having a backup plan in case all of Death's other attempts fail.
What if we didn't change anything?
What are you talking about?
What if us being here, right now, was the plan from the beginning?
This is kind of a cop-out, but I do accept it due to the fact that this is the fourth movie. Death getting beaten has become kind of a regular pattern, so it makes sense Death would go, alright, they keep beating me. This time I'll just account for that possibility. Thing is, this twist essentially makes the entire movie a big red herring to throw off the audience. So it isn't really playing fair. We couldn't have known Death had a backup plan outside of his second attempt to kill them. But then again, I did say that Life and Death play dirty. Admittedly, this movie has some cool kills. I'll never be able to look at an escalator the same way again. But aside from that, I do struggle to find more to say about it. So I guess I'll leave it at that. And finally on our list, let's get right up inside Final Destination 5. After rewatching this movie in preparation for this video, it does hold up a lot better than I remember. I remember deeply hating this last time I saw it, and I'm still not a huge fan of the writing. But admittedly, I am in love with this intro sequence. You guys know I love practical effects, so seeing an intro with names actually physically printed on panes of glass getting hit in slow-mo by objects that have killed people from across the entire franchise? Yeah, what's not to love here? It's a great celebration of the road up to this point. And the final end credits bookend the franchise with the same energy by showing highlights of all the deaths we've seen. But, intro and outro aside, this movie does do a couple things worth mentioning. As previously stated, this movie is a prequel to the first one, meaning that even though this movie came out in 2011, it's set before 1999. A fact the film cleverly hides from you during its entire runtime until exactly when it wants you to know, which is at the end of the film in a massive twist. But that doesn't mean the time period that this is set during wasn't hinted at earlier, as an eagle-eyed audience goer could have noticed that all the phones used in the movie are old model flip phones or corded phones. Phones that typically weren't used in 2011. And, this might just be a me thing, but even the color grading for this film seems to hint that it's set in the past. But I could just be reading into that. Another highlight of this movie is, of course, the return of Bloodworth. And Tony Todd is still acting circles around everyone. I swear, that man could make any dialogue sound like the greatest lines ever written.
What's happening to us?
What makes you think I know anything?
You warned us. At the memorial service, you said Death didn't like to be cheated.
It's just that I've seen this before.
You've seen what?
A lucky few survive the disaster, and then one by one, death comes for them all. You changed things on that bridge. There's a wrinkle in reality, and that wrinkle is you.
But considering that this is the last installment in the franchise, currently, the filmmakers seemed to want to nail down who exactly Bloodworth was before it ended. And here, he's portrayed as a simple human mortician, which is in complete contradiction to everything that his cameos in Final Destination 3 implied, which I think was the wrong direction to take his character. He even says specifically that he doesn't make the rules. The beauty of his character was the ambiguity, the fact that he was so malleable that he could fit into a wide range of theories. So actually getting answers is a bit underwhelming. Admittedly, however, you could argue that this is all a facade, that he is Death, or Life if you prefer. and is pretending to be human as to not burn out the brains of these small, insignificant humans. And for me personally, these revelations don't even scratch the surface of Bloodworth. His character is still badass, and will always remain so. There's just a little less mystery present now.
You were supposed to die on that bridge. You're not supposed to be here. You're shorted death. So you let death have somebody else in your place, and then you take their spot in the realm of the living, all the days and years that they've yet to live. And they take your place in death. Then the books are balanced.
Wait a minute. We kill someone, we get their life?
I don't make the rules. I just clean up after the game is over.
But the major way that this film tries to shake things up from the typical format is by introducing a rule that if you kill someone else on death's list, you basically gain all their time left. Again though, this is only a temporary reprieve, so it's a rule I accept because it doesn't outright beat death. As far as new rules go, this doesn't really change much or recontextualize the past films as much as it might seem, and really functions more as a red herring to make the audience feel like they know where this movie's going. My interpretation of Bloodworth's advice in this movie is that, yes, he has answers, but not always the answers you seek, because this ultimately has nothing to do with how the last survivors end up dying. But Bloodworth laying out an answer for us gives the audience a false sense of security, only for the movie to pull the rug out in the last act with the prequel revelation twist. Basically, the twist is that the ending of this movie is set during the beginning of the first movie, specifically during the explosion of Flight 180, which was hinted at during several blink-and-you'll-miss-it moments where our main characters regularly mention having a flight to catch.
Molly, your ticket's canceled. Tell me that's a mistake.
That I don't think it's such a good idea.
What, the trip? I don't know, man. I mean, they want to send me to the flagship restaurant in Paris.
You should take the job. Go to Paris.
It's really cool to see this in future rewatches with the understanding that their fate has been sealed since the start of the film. And having the last movie in the franchise end where the first movie began was very cathartic, for me at least. And there is a layer of consistency with past films, except in the wrong direction. Much like the ending of the third movie, our survivors don't figure out what's happening until it's too late to escape. This shows death functioning on the logic that it evolved from the third movie, but it doesn't make sense at this point in the timeline since that movie hasn't actually happened yet. Death shouldn't know this trick, otherwise it would have used it in the first two movies. It's a twist that feels cool, but the more you think on it, it just doesn't make sense. However, I have to compliment the way that they blended shots from the first movie with new scenes shot for this one. Immaculate and seamless. But none of this is even touching on my biggest issue with this twist. Because, since this is a prequel, it essentially tells the audience that Flight 180 isn't the original cause of all the events in the past movies. The bridge is technically the first disaster. Flight 180's explosion was just death dealing with a separate bunch of nitwits fucking up the design. Which is just a shame. Side tangent, I feel really bad for Death in these movies. Poor guy can't catch a break. I always thought the callbacks to Flight 180 were one of the coolest aspects of this franchise. One single event that threw off all of time and space, forcing Death to start hunting down people in order to reassert the timelines. But with this revelation, all the Flight 180 motifs make far less sense, which we still see even at the start of this movie, which doesn't work because Flight 180 hasn't even crashed yet. So those numbers don't mean anything to anyone right now, as a warning or an omen. Believe me when I say that I have tried my hardest to create a headcanon to explain this, because on its face, it just looks like the writers put in Flight 180 references because it was in every movie leading up to this, and they knew the audience would start to catch on to the twist if they never saw it. It was a cheap trick to keep us from guessing the twist. I would have been more impressed if they didn't put 180s in this one. Some of my headcanon possibilities to explain this have been that maybe 180 is just a cursed number, and it was never really in reference to Flight 180 in the first place. Or perhaps the explosion of Flight 180 had ripples forward and backward through time, essentially working like foreshadowing at this point in the timeline. But in the end, there's no evidence of any of this being true. It remains unexplained, leaving it up to the viewer to reconcile, so it's just bad writing. There are a ton of cool deaths in this movie, admittedly, but a lot of the fun in this one is undermined, for me at least, by a plot that is actively harming the other movies retroactively, which prevents me from really getting on board with this installment, leaving off the series on a bit of a sour note for me. Granted, a lot of effort was put into this one, but personally, I just feel the writers were running on fumes a bit here. Which is why I'm really intrigued by the next installment currently in production. You might think I would be pessimistic over a sequel coming out so many years after the supposed final installment. And I'll admit, yeah, I'm a bit worried. The Saw franchise now has 3 new movies after supposedly ending, and only one of them was worth coming back for. So I really hope they don't drive this franchise into the ground with the next one. But I'm also really excited. The lore is very different for Final Destination compared to other franchises. It isn't really a set-in-stone kind of lore. It's very flexible and open to recontextualization and reinterpretation. So there's a clearer pathway to success here than there is really with Saw, which will probably just be another copycat. Let's just hope death doesn't come for the franchise itself. Wait a minute. Oh no, that was my conclusion. That means... Alright, I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, be sure to hit that bell down there. And if you've seen any of these movies, I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. But, as always,
I'll see you soon.